What if the darkest moments of World War II weren't on the battlefield but buried in locked archives, whispered through censored reports, and erased from official memory? These aren't the stories you learned in school. These are secrets suppressed for decades, too disturbing, too dangerous, and too real. From human experiments and occult relics to firestorms disguised as strategy, what you're about to see exposes a side of World War II they never wanted you to uncover. In the biting cold of northern Norway, hidden beyond the veil of snow-covered mountains and thick Arctic fog, lies the former village of Skarsoy, a name long erased from official maps. In early 1944, this remote settlement became the silent witness to one of the most concealed Allied operations of World War II, Operation Medusa. Though few have heard of it, whispers of its brutality have persisted among the descendants of its last surviving witnesses. Skarsoy was a fishing village, home to less than 120 inhabitants. Its isolation made it nearly invisible to the outside world, except to British intelligence. According to heavily redacted files recently unearthed in London's War Office archives, Skarsoy was flagged as a high-risk red zone for suspected Nazi collaboration. The evidence, however, was thin. A single intercepted radio signal, reportedly traced near the area, was all it took to label the village a strategic threat. Operation Medusa was sanctioned under absolute secrecy. Officially, it never existed. Its commander, Major Frederick Voss, was known for his ruthless efficiency in clandestine missions. His orders were clear: neutralize any potential Nazi collaboration in Skarsoy and leave no trace. Accompanying him was a hand-picked team of 27 British and American commandos, elite, silent, and trained in cold-weather warfare. On the night of February 3, 1944, the unit approached Skarsoy under heavy snow cover. Eyewitness accounts from nearby villages speak of distant gunshots, burning smoke on the horizon, and the dull thrum of engines cutting through the blizzard. What happened in the next 12 hours was later called, by a surviving operative in a deathbed confession, a scorched earth execution. The commandos descended on Skarsoy like ghosts. They swept through homes, dragging families out into the cold. Anyone who resisted, or even hesitated, was labeled a collaborator. Men were separated, interrogated in makeshift snow-dug bunkers, and executed without trial. Women and children were herded into the church, which was then burned to the ground. Out of 120 villagers, only 7 were ever confirmed to have survived. They fled into the wilderness and, over the following weeks, were taken in by Sami tribes. Their testimonies, long ignored, tell of uniformed soldiers with British accents, frostbitten faces, and cruel efficiency. One survivor, Olav Rensvik, recalled how his brother was accused of sending Morse code from a makeshift antenna, an antenna that, according to Olav, was nothing more than a laundry line. What makes the story more disturbing is not just the brutality, but the aftermath. British forces ensured that the village's remains were sterilized, a term found in Voss's private diary, now held in a restricted archive in Edinburgh. Entire buildings were demolished, photographs confiscated or destroyed, and the land deemed uninhabitable. By 1946, Skarsoy was simply gone. But the story didn't end there. In 1992, a Norwegian amateur historian named Eirik Langland stumbled upon a cache of bones while hiking near the fjord. Initially believing them to be ancient, carbon testing revealed they were from the 1940s. Further excavation uncovered personal items, a charred crucifix, a scorched children's shoe, and several British-made .303 shell casings. His findings were quietly confiscated by the Norwegian Ministry of Defense under national security interests. Langland later published a heavily censored blog post about his experience, and died in a car crash 3 weeks later. Journalists who attempted to follow the trail hit dead ends. Requests for files under the UK's Freedom of Information Act were denied. The name Operation Medusa appeared in only one remaining declassified memo, marked with a red X and stamped, Purge Directive, actioned 1947. The directive listed Medusa alongside 3 other black operations, all of which remained sealed under high-level clearance. In 2008, a British veteran named Colin Reeves, dying of lung cancer, confessed to his role in the massacre. In a recorded interview never aired by BBC, Reeves said, We weren't soldiers that night. We were erasers. We were told it was for the good of Europe, to kill the cancer before it spread. When asked about Nazi presence in Skarsoy, he shook his head. None. Not one. Just scared people who spoke the wrong language too close to the wrong signal. To this day, no official statement from the British or Norwegian governments has acknowledged Operation Medusa. Skarsoy remains omitted from historical maps post-1944, and satellite imagery shows nothing but empty snowfields. Yet, every winter, a small wooden cross appears in the snow at the site, left anonymously, year after year. There are questions that linger in the silence of the Arctic wind. Why was Skarsoy really targeted? Who authorized the sterilization order? And what truly matters in war, victory, or the price paid in innocence? Perhaps some secrets are buried not because they are forgotten, but because they are unforgivable. In the opulent silence of Vatican City's corridors, where gold-leafed frescoes meet centuries of sacred tradition, an unholy alliance once whispered behind closed doors, a pact shrouded in incense and secrecy, hidden beneath layers of ritual and robes. During the darkest days of World War II, the Holy See was not merely a neutral spiritual beacon. It was, for a brief time, a silent chess player navigating a deadly game between morality and survival. At the center of this dangerous game were secret negotiations between high-ranking Vatican officials and members of the Nazi SS. Officially, the Vatican maintained neutrality throughout the war, offering prayers for peace and humanitarian aid across borders. But recently uncovered documents from an obscure Catholic archive in Avellino, Italy, sealed until 2022, paint a far murkier picture. These papers include coded telegrams, financial ledgers, and memos from Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian clergyman with direct ties to several Nazi leaders. For decades, Hudal was dismissed as a fringe figure. But these files prove he was the Vatican's unofficial intermediary with the Third Reich. The negotiations began in 1942, as the tide of war was uncertain and the Vatican feared communist expansion from the East more than Nazi tyranny. Hudal proposed a secret understanding. If the Vatican helped certain Nazi elites escape eventual retribution, those officers would, in turn, protect Catholic institutions across occupied Europe. Hitler, while anti-clerical in private, understood the power of the Church's influence and greenlit quiet cooperation. Thus began the construction of the Ratlins. Ratlins were covert escape routes stretching from Germany and Austria through Italy and into South America. Their arteries pulsed through monasteries, parishes, and safe houses manned by clergy who may not have known the full scope of their mission. But Bishop Hudal knew. From his office in the Pontifical Teutonic College, just steps from St. Peter's Basilica, he coordinated falsified identity papers, new baptismal certificates, and even post-war aliases for men like Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele. One document, signed under a pseudonym believed to be used by Hudal, lists code names for dozens of Nazi officials alongside departure dates and ship manifests from Genoa to Buenos Aires. Each record bears the crest of the Red Cross and a Vatican seal, authenticating travel for displaced persons. These documents were not lost to time. They were deliberately hidden, shielded under the Vatican's sovereign immunity. Among the most chilling revelations is a transcript of a meeting between SS officer Karl Wolff and a Vatican aide in 1943. In it, Wolff promises protection for churches in northern Italy, on the condition that the church remain publicly neutral and quietly assist in post-war preservation for loyal officers. Wolff would later be one of the few high-ranking Nazis not executed after the war. His sentence was mysteriously commuted. The cover-up extended well into the post-war years. Pope Pius XII, now a controversial figure in historical circles, was aware of Hudal's actions. Though the Vatican later claimed it distanced itself from him, no disciplinary action was ever taken. In fact, internal correspondence shows that Hudal continued to receive church funding well into the 1950s. The moral cost was immense. While priests in occupied Poland were being executed and Jewish families begged for sanctuary, the same church was simultaneously funneling war criminals to safety. The logic: preserve the church's influence in the post-war world at any cost. One memo put it bluntly: better the devils we know than the devils we fear. What is perhaps most damning is the Vatican's silence. When post-war investigators approached church officials with questions about Hudal's role, they were stonewalled. Many of the Ratland documents were either relocated to the Vatican Secret Archives, now the Vatican Apostolic Archive, or destroyed entirely. Survivors who attempted to speak out were dismissed, labeled as conspiracy theorists or communists seeking to damage the church's reputation. In 1963, a South American journalist named Claudio Bernal claimed to have traced a Nazi war criminal's escape route directly through a monastery in Trieste, Italy. He published a short exposé linking the route to a bishop with direct connections to the Vatican. Days after his piece went to print, Bernal vanished. His body was never found, and his article was quietly retracted by the newspaper's new editorial team. Decades later, in the early 2000s, declassified CIA documents confirmed what many had long suspected. American intelligence knew about the Ratlands and even tacitly supported some of them, using fleeing Nazis as assets in the growing Cold War. The Vatican, it seemed, was not alone in playing a double game. But its involvement cut deepest, because it was not expected from those who claimed moral authority over good and evil. Today, the Vatican maintains its silence. Official church historians dismiss these findings as uncontextualized fragments, arguing that war forces impossible choices. Yet, survivors of the Holocaust and families of the disappeared remember otherwise. In their stories, the church is not just a bystander, it is a silent accomplice, cloaked in righteousness. As the Vatican slowly releases more documents under pressure from international historians, one truth becomes clear. The full extent of its wartime involvement may never be known. Not because the evidence is gone, but because some doors, especially those made of centuries-old oak and locked from within, remain firmly shut. In the Sistine Chapel, visitors from around the world marvel at Michelangelo's depiction of the Last Judgment. Few realize that beneath their feet, in the Vatican's sealed archives, rests a judgment of another kind, one not painted in divine glory, but stained by moral compromise and sealed in silence. Buried deep in the Loire Valley of central France, beneath the facade of a decommissioned monastery, lies the shadowy legacy of Unit 13, a secret American psychological warfare facility established in 1943 and abandoned by 1946. Though virtually unknown to the public and absent from official war records, this facility operated under the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. Its mission was not intelligence gathering, but experimentation, to study how the human mind could be broken, rebuilt, or erased entirely. The monastery, known to locals as Le Monastère Noir, the Black Monastery, had stood for centuries before it was quietly purchased by the U.S. military under the guise of a logistics depot. Its thick stone walls, underground crypts, and remote location made it an ideal location for operations requiring absolute discretion. French records show an unexplained influx of American personnel in the nearby village of Saint-Aubin-des-Roches, all under diplomatic protection and forbidden from engaging with the locals. Declassified OSS memoranda from the late 1970s, long buried within the National Archives, first hinted at Unit 13's existence. Codenamed Project Ember, the facility was described as a controlled psychological environment for enemy combatant analysis. But analysis was a generous euphemism. Surviving logs reveal that the site became a testing ground for emerging psychological manipulation techniques, including sensory deprivation, drug-induced hypnosis, forced identity reshaping, and what was referred to as cognitive destabilization protocols. Roughly 73 captured German officers were processed through Unit 13. None were high command, all were mid-level SS officers, ideal subjects for targeted reprogramming. According to testimony from a former OSS psychologist, Dr. Ernest Morel, extracted from a sealed deposition in 1982, prisoners were placed in individual isolation chambers, pitch black, soundproof, temperature-controlled, and left for days without human contact. There was no screaming, Morel claimed, just silence, the kind that eats at your brain. After a week, they couldn't remember their own names. That's when we began the real work. What followed was a brutal regimen of suggestion therapy, narcotics, and staged interactions where prisoners were convinced they were in alternate realities. One officer, Oberstleutnant Felix Dreyer, was allegedly made to believe the war had ended in German victory, and he had been reassigned to an alternate division. For weeks, he followed fabricated orders and communicated with actors posing as officers. When he finally realized it was an illusion, he attempted suicide by biting into an electrical panel. Another subject, SS Captain Lothar Müller, was exposed to looping audio recordings of his own family pleading for his cooperation. Recordings later revealed to be entirely fabricated by voice actors using captured German intelligence. He broke after 23 days, agreeing to deliver a false testimony to other prisoners in exchange for being reunited with his wife. The woman presented to him was a French operative. He never knew the truth until weeks later, at which point he lapsed into a state of psychosis and never recovered. Unit 13's experiments were driven by a desire to crack the Nazi code, not their encryption, but their psychology. OSS leadership believed that if the mindset of Nazi loyalty could be unraveled, it could be used to demoralize German troops and prepare post-war German society for re-education. In theory, it was strategic brilliance. In execution, it was psychological butchery. Very little physical evidence of Unit 13 remains. In 1946, the OSS was dissolved, and the facility was quietly abandoned. French authorities who entered the building found destroyed documents, blood-stained bedding, and evidence of unorthodox medical equipment. A French intelligence officer named André Leclerc wrote a personal letter describing the scene. This was no hospital. This was a temple of madness. The U.S. denied all involvement. Journalists who attempted to investigate were stonewalled, and French records of the site were sealed under bilateral agreements. But the name Unit 13 resurfaced decades later during investigations into CIA behavior modification programs, particularly MKUltra. A 1963 internal CIA memo, declassified in 2001, references predecessor data collected from Ember Phase 1 France, strongly suggesting that Unit 13 was the prototype for later Cold War psychological experiments on American soil. In 2011, a team of independent researchers and documentarians managed to gain access to the ruins of the Black Monastery. Hidden beneath collapsed floorboards in one of the subchambers, they discovered fragments of metal ID tags, restraints, and a rusted audio device with strips of German speech etched onto tape reels. The contents were unintelligible, warped by time and moisture, but one phrase was clearly audible, repeated again and again: "Ich bin nicht ich." I am not me. Some of the surviving personnel involved in Unit 13 never spoke of their experiences. A few, however, left behind cryptic writings. Dr. Morell's private journal, published posthumously, ends with the line, "We didn't just break men. We cracked the mirror of the mind and stared into the pieces. What looked back was us." To this day, no official acknowledgement of Unit 13 has ever been made by the U.S. government. No reparations were offered, no public reckoning initiated. The ruined monastery now stands as a silent scar in the French countryside, surrounded by trees, avoided by locals, and visited only by the wind that whistles through its broken stone halls. The truth about Unit 13 remains fractured, like the minds it shattered. But every whisper, every buried record, every survivor's nightmare pushes the truth closer to the surface. The question is not whether it happened, but how much of it we're still willing to remember. In the final months of World War II, when Allied victory was all but assured, the ancient German city of Dresden was turned into a hellscape of fire and ash. Between February 13th and 15th, 1945, over 3,900 tons of explosives were dropped on the city by British and American bombers in a relentless series of air raids. What followed was not just a military operation, it was a calculated annihilation. Tens of thousands of civilians, many of them refugees fleeing the Red Army from the east, were incinerated. And yet, what the world was told then, and for decades after, was a carefully curated version of the truth. Official records labeled Dresden a strategic target, claiming the city housed military installations and war factories. But internal Allied memos, classified until the 1990s, revealed a different motive: psychological warfare. According to a directive marked Top Secret, Eyes Only, from the British Air Ministry, the objective was to break the morale of the enemy population and demonstrate the futility of further resistance. The destruction of Dresden was not intended to cripple industry, it was designed to send a message. Winston Churchill himself, just days after the raids, seemed to grow uneasy with what had been unleashed. In a memorandum dated March 28, 1945, he wrote, "The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing." But his words came too late. The firebombing had already wiped out most of the city center, including its Baroque landmarks and historic cathedral. The flames were so intense they created a firestorm, a vortex of superheated air that sucked oxygen from the lungs of those hiding in underground shelters. Survivor accounts describe scenes of apocalyptic horror. Streets boiled with molten asphalt. Children's bodies fused together as they clung to one another. The sky turned orange at midnight, and smoke rose 5 miles into the air. The German authorities couldn't accurately count the dead, most were burned beyond recognition, but estimates range from 25,000 to 35,000 lives lost in a single night. So why Dresden? Declassified communications between RAF Bomber Command and U.S. Strategic Air Forces reveal a hidden agenda: pressure from Joseph Stalin. The Soviet leader wanted the Allies to punish Germany's rear lines and slow the retreat of Nazi forces toward the Eastern Front. Dresden, a cultural city with minimal air defenses, was chosen not for its military value, but for its vulnerability. Some historians argue Dresden was also a political demonstration, a fiery warning to both Germany and the Soviet Union about the destructive reach of Allied air power. It was, in essence, the Western Allies flexing muscle in the closing chapters of a war that was already won. The post-war narrative was tightly controlled. The US and Britain maintained that all targets were of strategic value. Civilians, they said, were tragically collateral. But the cover began to crack in the 1960s, when former RAF pilots began speaking out. One, Group Captain Richard Reeve, confessed in an interview, "We knew what we were doing. There were no factories down there. We flew low and saw the people running. They weren't soldiers. They were mothers, children, old men." The most damning evidence came in 1971, when a memo from Air Marshal Arthur Harris, head of Bomber Command, was discovered in a private collection. In it, Harris wrote, "The aim is to make the rubble bounce. Let them burn. Let them see that fire rains from the heavens." Harris was later honored with a statue in London, though his role in the Dresden firebombing remains deeply controversial. Despite the mounting evidence, governments were reluctant to acknowledge Dresden as a war crime. The Geneva Conventions of the time did not yet fully protect civilian populations from aerial assault, and the victors of war seldom stand trial. But that didn't stop the survivors from speaking. In 1995, at the 50th anniversary of the bombing, German President Roman Herzog stood in front of the ruins of the Frauenkirche and said, "This was not justice. This was fury, unchecked." His words echoed across Europe and forced a public reckoning. Memorials to the victims were erected. Dresden's reconstruction became a symbol of resilience, but the trauma remained. Modern analysts have combed through aerial reconnaissance photos taken before the raids. They confirm that most of the targets hit were residential, not military. A few scattered factories were located miles outside the blast zone, untouched. Entire neighborhoods, however, some housing refugees and hospital patients, were reduced to cinders. In 2008, newly uncovered footage from a U.S. reconnaissance drone showed incendiary patterns specifically designed to create maximum heat zones, an intentional trigger for the firestorm effect. One frame showed civilians clustering in the city square moments before the first wave of bombs struck. Today, Dresden's rebuilt skyline glows with restored beauty, but beneath its cobblestones are the bones of the forgotten. The city remains a haunting testament to the blurred line between strategy and atrocity. In textbooks, it is often footnoted. In official war histories, it is summarized. But in the hearts of those who know the full story, Dresden is not a symbol of victory. It is a scar, deep and deliberate. What makes Dresden even darker is not just the bombing itself, but the decades of silence and spin that followed. The calculated shaping of memory, the suppression of documents, and the rewriting of motives. It was not just a city that burned, it was truth, too. In the winter of 1945, as Nazi Germany faced imminent collapse, one of the largest maritime evacuations in history unfolded along the icy Baltic Sea. Known as Operation Hannibal, it was a desperate attempt by the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, to rescue civilians and retreating soldiers from the advancing Soviet army. Between January and May, more than 2 million people were transported across treacherous, frozen waters. But amid the chaos, hundreds of ships vanished without a trace. Some were torpedoed. Others went silent mid-transit. And a few simply disappeared, into fog, into the sea, or perhaps, into the darker margins of wartime secrecy. The official narrative claims these ships were lost to Soviet submarines or Arctic storms. But a collection of recently unsealed files from post-war Allied intelligence suggests something stranger, and far more sinister, took place during this mass exodus. Among the most infamous losses was the Wilhelm Gustloff, a cruise liner-turned-evacuation vessel. On January 30, 1945, it was torpedoed by Soviet submarine S-13, killing over 9,000 people, most of them civilians. For decades, it was assumed this was the worst maritime disaster in history and a tragic anomaly. But buried within Soviet naval logs and declassified U.S. Navy intercepts are reports of 4 other ships, all part of the same convoy, vanishing that same night under unexplained circumstances. One such vessel, the SS Herder, was carrying high-ranking SS officers, Nazi gold, and classified documents allegedly related to Hitler's final solution. According to decoded Enigma transmissions intercepted by British intelligence, the Herder issued a distress signal at 2:17 hours, unidentified vessel in pursuit. Silent running failed. They are inside. Then nothing. No wreckage was ever recovered. No survivors. In fact, the Herder never appeared in German naval manifests following that night, almost as if its journey had been erased. This wasn't an isolated event. At least 9 ships in Operation Hannibal's route between Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland, and Kiel vanished without any record of engagement. The Soviet Union never claimed credit for their sinking. Allied navies had no operations in the region. So what happened to these ghost ships? One theory involves Project Odin, a secret Nazi program believed to have been smuggling advanced weapons prototypes and sensitive personnel out of Germany. U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps documents dated June 1945 reference multiple maritime transfers of high-value Nazi scientists under Hannibal cover. Some of these individuals later appeared in the U.S. under Operation Paperclip, but many did not. Their names appeared once in intercepted manifests, then vanished forever. In 1993, German diver and researcher Karl Hausmann made a chilling discovery. While exploring a submerged wreck believed to be the SS Kohler, 120 miles off the Polish coast, he found an unregistered cargo hold hidden behind welded bulkheads. Inside were rusted crates filled with documents, gas masks, and a heavily corroded lead cylinder containing glass slides and photographic negatives. When cleaned, they revealed strange symbols, diagrams of circular aircraft, energy field notations, and blueprints bearing the insignia of the SS Ahnenerbe, the Nazi pseudoscientific occult division. Shortly after Hausmann shared his findings with a university in Leipzig, he suffered a mysterious accident while diving in the same location. His body was recovered with severe decompression trauma inconsistent with his dive profile. The camera containing his footage was missing. Independent researchers who analyzed recovered documents now believe some ships in Operation Hannibal were not merely evacuating people, they were transporting the arcane. The Ahnenerbe had spent years scouring Europe and the Middle East for ancient relics and lost technologies. When Berlin began to fall, there was a last-ditch effort to get these artifacts out, by sea. One of the lost ships, the SS Ostermann, was reportedly carrying Item 472B, believed by some to be the Spear of Destiny, the legendary weapon said to have pierced the side of Christ and allegedly imbued with supernatural power. This speculation may sound far-fetched, but Allied reports did track multiple Nazi expeditions into Austria, Italy, and even Tibet in search of such relics. Even more disturbing is the radio silence surrounding these vessels. Transcripts from British Bletchley Park show a dramatic blackout of Hannibal-related naval communications between February 5 and 11, 1945. Several decoded messages reference a codename, Black Tide. No one knows what it truly meant, but a handwritten annotation on one decoded sheet reads, "Do not pursue. Let them pass into the mist." To this day, Baltic fishermen occasionally report sonar echoes of massive wrecks in areas with no recorded battles. The sea has a long memory, and sometimes it reveals secrets not meant to surface. In 2016, a Polish underwater exploration team used side-scan sonar to locate a shipwreck off the Hel Peninsula. When they descended, they found a hull matching the herder's design, but oddly intact, with no evidence of torpedo damage. Inside, preserved by the cold, was a body in full SS uniform slumped against a wall with a pistol in hand. On the steel bulkhead above him, scratched in blood or rust, were the words, "We're sind nicht tot. We're War 10. We are not dead. We are waiting." Operation Hannibal succeeded in evacuating millions, but at a cost that remains incalculable. It was not just a rescue. It was a mass disappearance. A ritual exodus shrouded in fog, fear, and silence. Whether it was occult cargo, stolen knowledge, or human experiments hidden at sea, what truly disappeared in those ghost convoys was never just flesh and steel. It was truth, buried with the dead in cold, silent waters. Every case adds a new layer of mystery, leaving more questions than answers. Which one lingers in your mind, and what's your take on what really happened?